Again, thank you for the introduction. Happy to be here. I'm a little bit of an imposter because I'm a TOC practitioner, but I think like a lot of TOC practitioners over the years, we've had a huge exposure to Lean. And of course, we've worked with a lot of organizations that, in fact, because we specialize in working with manufacturers, most, if not all of our clients pretty much are Lean practitioners. And in the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of sharing of ideas between Lean and TOC. So I'm really happy to be here talking to a Lean audience. I want to introduce you to what we call sales process engineering, which I think you could, I'd like to think that you will identify this as a Lean approach to the design of the sales function. We're here to talk about the design of the sales function, not to talk about sales. My assumption when we talk about the sales function is that you have people who can sell already. There's plenty of other people who talk about salesmanship. I want to talk about how we engineer the sales function. And what I'm going to do is propose to you a method for engineering the sales function that results in a radical increase in the volume of sales activity in exchange for, in many cases, a reduction in expenses. So the holy grail, if you like. Over the years, I've met with a number of organizations that have implemented Lean and as a consequence freed up massive amount of production capacity. And it's always sad in those situations to see organizations divesting of or retiring production capacity when presumably, or at least from my perspective, the more exciting opportunities to go and sell that additional capacity. In many cases, organizations just don't have an understanding of sales or an understanding of how to build a sales machine to achieve that. And that's the gap that this webinar is designed to address. So what I want to do is to start with the end, if you like, to start with a picture of what a typical organization might look like after implementing the suggestions that I'm about to give you in the balance of the webinar. So I think it's very helpful to start with a clear understanding of where we're going. So what I want to do is to present to you two fictitious organizations. One of them I'm going to call Bravo Inc., the other one Alpha. And I've chosen those names deliberately because B stands for before and A stands for after. So you could think of this as two organizations, if you liked, maybe competitors in the same industry. Or you could think of it as a before and after story where Bravo is the before and Alpha is the after. So let's talk about Bravo, this fictitious organization. What I've done here is charted for you their sales function. So when we look at Bravo, we see that they have a head office here. And in that head office, they have a VP of sales, two field-based sales representatives, two customer service representatives, and in head office there's a marketing specialist as well. And presumably in head office there's the engineering function and the production function and distribution and finance and the rest of the corporate furniture. So that's simple enough. But what's interesting about this picture is that Bravo has expanded by opening up regional offices. And each regional office is pretty much a photocopy of the sales function at head office minus the marketing specialist. So in each regional office we have a general manager who perhaps thinks of themselves as a sales manager, but who tends to behave more as a general manager by virtue of the fact that they're the more senior person in the office. So we have a general manager, two field-based sales reps, and two customer service reps. And the head office has repeated that exercise in duplication a couple of times. So the end result is that we now have four sales locations with a total of 2, 4, 6, 8 field reps and 3 senior sales-related managers, and we'll assume for the purpose of this exercise that all of those individuals spend some time out in the field selling, and we're making all these assumptions because, as I guess you're aware already, this is pretty typical of what we see when we travel around the States, or when anyone travels around the States and has a look at medium-sized manufacturing firms. Now I've got some icons here colored to indicate the pay grade. Now, the actual number isn't important, but it's a relative measure here. So you can see the red people here are 150K people, and the orange ones 100K, and the green ones 50K. Now, what's important here, from an operational perspective, at least to me, and I would encourage you to think of this as important to you, is the volume of activity. And what I'm interested in is the meaningful activity, or what we call meaningful conversations. So whenever we look at a sales function, what we want to know is how many meaningful conversations are occurring in that function. And typically we're interested on a weekly or a daily basis. So what I've done here is I've done a stock take, the number of meaningful conversations that occur in this organization per week. Now the interesting thing is, in a typical sales environment, and it really doesn't matter what country we're talking about, what industry, what we discover is that a typical salesperson does 2 true business development appointments a week, regardless of the industry, regardless of the country or the region within the country. And the balance of the salesperson's time is spent on other stuff. And on the occasions that we find salespeople who do perform more than 2 business development or 2 sales meetings a week, we discover that only 2 meetings a week typically can truly be regarded as business development meetings. The rest of them are, dropping in on existing accounts to pick up transactions that are in the offing. The type of appointments we refer to typically as milk run appointments. So in this environment, here's what we would typically expect to see. In each location, we have 3 people performing 2 business development appointments a week. And we're assuming that each of those 3 people, the sales manager or the VP and the 2 field reps, are performing a couple of business development appointments a day and a couple of business development appointments a week and 15 meaningful telephone-based conversations. So that's typically what we'd see in an environment like this. And if we total up the headcount and the payroll, what we discover in this environment is we have 21 people working in the sales function, and we have a payroll of about $1.9 million. Now, in isolation, this doesn't tell us a lot. I think it's enough to acknowledge that this is a fair representation of what we're likely to see in a medium-sized manufacturing firm that sells direct. Where it gets interesting, though, is where we raise the question, well, is it possible to redesign the sales function such that it performs more efficiently? And if we were to do so, what would be the actual impact on cost, on headcount, on the volume of meaningful selling conversations, and on the quality of customer care? So with that in mind, what I want to do is to introduce you to alpha. Alpha as in after, if you want to think about this as a before and after scenario. So here we have a different configuration of resources. I'll explain it to you briefly, and then we'll talk about the implications if Bravo, rather than being structured as it were, was structured like Alpha here. So in Alpha's case, you'll see that we have a head office, and we don't have any regional offices. We have a VP of sales. Now the VP of sales has significantly more subordinates than the VP of sales did in Bravo's example. The direct reports to the VP of sales is a person we call an inside sales lead, and also the marketing specialist. And then where this gets really interesting is where we look at the makeup of the team of individual contributors. We have 3 inside salespeople. Now we didn't have any inside salespeople in the previous example. We have 2 field reps. Each field rep has a dedicated executive assistant. That's kind of interesting. We have 2 analysts, research analysts, responsible for building the house list. And we have a team of customer service reps. I think that's roughly the same number of customer service reps that we had previously. The difference is that all of them are operating out of head office. In fact, they have no choice because we no longer have any regional offices. We also have 2 characters we call project leaders, and I'll introduce them to you in a second as well, who we didn't have previously. So let me explain how this works. A significant percentage of the sales transactions that were being handled by salespeople previously are now being handled by the customer service team. And of the remaining transactions, a significant percentage of those are being handled by this new team of inside salespeople. So this team of inside salespeople is a team of salespeople who are just like field salespeople in every respect, other than for the fact that they happen to work inside. So Alpha, unlike Bravo, has a team of inside salespeople, true salespeople, people who sit on the telephone with headsets on and have 20+ meaningful conversations a day, something that didn't exist previously. Where field sales is concerned, Alpha has a much smaller field sales team. Alpha has 2 salespeople covering the entire region. But because Alpha has paired their field salespeople up with executive assistants, what that means is that Alpha's field reps can spend 100% of their time in the field. And the existence of those executive assistants mean that they have to do nothing other than face-to-face business development appointments. So interestingly, in Alpha's case, those 2 field reps can cover the same ground in terms of both volume of meaningful conversations and in terms of geography that, that Bravo's larger rep force could. We have 2 research analysts whose job is to build the house list, as we discussed previously. We have a marketing specialist whose job is to generate sales opportunities. We'll get to that in a minute. We have a much bigger customer service team. And then we have 2 project leaders, and these project leaders are engineering people who are comfortable in selling environments, who exist to assist the field reps in the prosecution of technical sales opportunities, meaning that, particularly in engineer-to-order environments, meaning that salespeople don't have to get tangled up in technical issues and trapped in production or engineering, as is typically the case. Now, we'll dig into all the components of this later, but I just wanted to describe the lay of the land to give you an idea of the fact that maybe this configuration of sales might actually work. Now, we'll get to the theory behind it, the philosophy, if you like, behind it, but this is just a picture of the end state. And let me show you the typical results that we would expect to see if Bravo reconfigured its sales operations to look like Alpha. In this configuration, we would expect to see 2 field-based sales reps performing 20 true business development meetings a week each. We would expect these people's calendar to be scheduled for them by their EAs. So they would spend a few days in Chicago, a few days in Atlanta, go home for the weekend, and then travel to another location the next week. And they would perform 4 to 5 appointments a day, 5 days a week, averaging about 20 business development appointments a week. In other words, in this environment, field reps would be easily capable of performing 10 times the volume of meaningful selling conversations as the sales reps in the previous environment. We then have an inside sales team performing about 100 meaningful conversations a week, which is a very conservative estimate. As we discussed before, we have all of those other resources, but we won't consider them because at this point we're just considering the impact on cost and activity. Where costs are concerned, we have a headcount of 20 and a payroll of $1.4 million. Now, of course, the other most obvious change here is we've eliminated all those regional offices. And you're probably wondering to yourself, is that good or bad that we've eliminated the regional offices? Well, there are 2 reasons why we need regional offices. One is to put people close to customers, and the other is to put inventory close to customers. So if you have reason or need to put inventory close to customers, opening regional offices is, to my mind, the least effective way of achieving that. There are logistics providers who can solve that problem for you. And when it comes to putting people close to customers, I would argue that it makes a hell of a lot of sense to think very carefully about which people, for what reason, actually need to be co-located with customers, particularly as more and more transactions are occurring over the telephone or online. But we'll get to that argument in a minute. So I've created a little table here showing you a comparison of these 2 models. Assuming the 2 organizations are the same or similar, it's interesting to look at the 2 of them side by side. So where headcount's concerned, the first number is the 150K people, the second number the 100, the next number the 50. So you can see in Bravo's case they had 21 team members, in Alpha's case they have 20 team members, so a slight reduction in headcount. Payroll cost has gone from $1.9 to $1.4 million. The volume of meaningful conversations is the interesting one, though, because what this is suggesting to us is without any increase in operating expenses, simply by reconfiguring the design of the sales environment, Alpha is in a situation where the volume of meaningful selling conversations is up by 67%. Now, what we haven't taken into account here is any of the savings that have come from closing all those regional offices. Now, there would be savings in real estate costs, but there would also, in an environment like this, realistically be savings in the management infrastructure required to manage the complexity that multi-branch structure adds, but we're ignoring that. And to be fair, we're also ignoring any costs associated with outsourcing logistics in the Alpha model. Now, one element of this that I haven't discussed so far is customer service. And by customer service, I mean where simple transactions are concerned, how good a job do we do of turning around quotes quickly and orders quickly? And where more complex opportunities are concerned, you know, how good a job do we do of chaperoning those more complex engagements through sales and production. So I'm sure you've guessed already that the different structure that Alpha has adopted will have positive implications where customer service is concerned. And one of the main reasons why we will see positive implications is that we've taken all of those people who were previously remote from where critical decisions are made and moved them all to head office. So we've centralized as much decision-making as possible, and as you'll see in a minute, we will go to some effort to try and, or it will make sense to go to some effort to try and engineer the head office environment to ensure that people who need to take, or who need to consider the trade-offs of their decisions will be co-located with those people who are impacted by the decisions to make decision-making easier. So I would suggest, and my experience suggests, in a transition like this, you would expect to see quotation lead time drop from days to hours, and issue lead time, the time it takes to resolve issues, similarly drop from days to hours. So I'm suggesting that we really can have our cake and eat it in this scenario. I'm suggesting that it is possible to contain or possibly even reduce in the long run expenses, to increase significantly the volume of meaningful selling activity, and at the same time to improve customer service quality. So that's a brief introduction of the end state. What I want to do now is change gears completely and to attack this from a more theoretical perspective. And I want to start with two questions, and you can put your hands up if you like. I may not be able to see them, so I'm just going to have to imagine that I can see your hands. And here are my two questions for you. The first is, do you have currently unutilized production capacity? Now, it doesn't matter whether you're a manufacturer or if you're a knowledge work environment. I imagine most of you are manufacturers. But the question is, if you are, well, regardless of which, do you have underutilized production capacity? If you won more orders today, could you fulfill them without having to go and buy more plant and equipment or add more individual contributors in the plant? And my next question is your market share less than 20%? Now, I'm assuming that if I could see your hands, most people would be saying yes to these questions, and I can assume that with some confidence, because when I travel around the US and Australia, and the UK for that matter, and ask these two questions, I get yeses resoundingly. So what's interesting is not the questions so much as the conclusions that we can draw from these questions, and these two conclusions look obvious, self-evident almost. But when we dig into them, there's an interesting finding that comes out of these conclusions. So the two conclusions are that if you answer yes to both those questions, you have growth potential, and that your organization's constraint is in sales. I guess in the lean world, you would say your bottleneck is in sales. I would naturally say constraint, but the two terms are more or less interchangeable. So let me dig into the meaning of those two conclusions. The first thing that we concluded, or that I concluded, I should say, is that you have growth potential. And this chart shows exactly why that's the case. If you have production capacity, I suspect your current situation looks something like this. We have the production capacity that you're paying for when you write a check for your operating expenses every month, awards you a level of capacity indicated by this yellow line on the chart here. But in reality, you're using only a percentage of that. So the shaded area indicates what you're using, and the interesting thing about the shaded area is the variability in that line there. You know, there will be variation from month to month for obvious reasons. But where this gets interesting is where we add the missing factor, and that's the market. So if I was to front up to manufacturers and ask them, a whole bunch of them, why is it, and I've done this experiment, why is it that your plant is operating at less than full capacity, oftentimes I'll hear the market gets the blame for that. You know, we've just been through a tough time. We're still going through a tough time economically. It's reasonable, I think, or many people think, to blame the market. But is it? The interesting thing is, if I was to draw this chart to scale, the line here that represents the market demand in aggregate for your products and services would be so far up, you'd have to paint it on the wall above your monitor there. So even if you're in a relatively small marketplace, the market demand in aggregate is probably many times your production capacity. And if that's the case, it doesn't actually make sense to say, well, we're failing to sell all of our capacity because of the market. The reason why you're failing to sell all of your capacity is because your sales function is failing to go and win a sizable enough share of the existing aggregate demand in order to keep your production facility fully populated. And the question that I would like to ask is, well, why is it that you're not going and getting more sales? If you invest in this expensive infrastructure to provide you with production capacity, wouldn't it behoove you to ensure that at all times, come hell or high water, you were maintaining sales at a sufficient volume to keep production fully utilized? Now, if we went through such a terrible economic time that the market demand in aggregate dropped to the point that where it was less than your production capacity, then you at that point have a get-out-of-jail-free card. But until that point, the purpose of your sales function should be to go out, in most cases, and win enough orders to keep your production capacity fully utilized. So that leads me to the second conclusion that I drew, the one about the constraint or the bottleneck. And that is that if your chart looks like the chart we were just looking at, the issue is not really the marketplace. The issue is sales. And the issue is that your sales function is the constraint instead of your production function. It would make a lot more sense in most cases to deliberately engineer your organization such that at all times production was fully loaded. In other words, it would make a lot more sense to you, and your bank manager would be a lot happier, if your organization was structured such that the job of sales was to maintain at all time a queue of forward orders upstream from production, meaning that production could operate consistently at full capacity day after day after day. That, for most of you, is the path to maximizing the profitability of your businesses. Keep production fully utilized, come hell or high water. And for most of you, the economics of your business are such that you should be realistically prepared to spend pretty much whatever it takes in order to maintain this queue of forward orders to enable your production to operate at full utilization 100% of the time. The problem is, for most of you, it doesn't matter how much you spend on sales. You've reached a point where you've hit diminishing returns, or your existing sales model has reached the point where it's hit diminishing returns, and we'll talk about why in a second. So you have two choices if you want to increase significantly the capacity of sales, and this is my suggestion. You do need to, most of you need to increase significantly the production of the capacity of your sales function. You have two choices. One is to employ more salespeople, and the second is to improve the productivity of your sales function. Now, I mentioned that many organizations have reached the point where they've hit diminishing returns. Now, the evidence of diminishing returns is that if you employ more salespeople, in other words, if you scale up your sales capacity, you don't see a commensurate increase in order flow. And I guess that's fairly obvious, because recruiting salespeople is not particularly difficult. If you could double sales just by doubling the size of your sales team, you would probably already be doubling the size of your sales team every few months rather than attending these webinars. So if we've reached the point of diminishing return where our sales function is concerned, that should cause us to ask some questions about how our sales function is engineered. Just as if we discovered that if we were a printer, for example, bolting more Heidelbergs to the floor no longer enabled us to increase production, we would have to ask some questions about, some fundamental questions about the design of our production facility. So let's ask those questions. Is there potential to increase significantly the productivity of the sales function by re-engineering the sales function rather than by adding more salespeople? And my suggestion is the answer to that question is a resounding yes. And the reason why is that the sales function today in a modern organization looks alarmingly like a production environment would have looked 100+ years ago. If you think about production environments 100+ years ago, you're probably imagining a craft shop type environment populated by artisans who by definition were responsible for managing entire end-to-end workflows. In other words, if you're imagining a shoe manufacturing concern, you're probably imagining a craft shop environment populated by a cobbler who is solely responsible for all of the steps associated with converting pigs or cows, whatever the case is, into pairs of shoes. And that is exactly what a sales function looks like today. In most organizations, even those organizations that appear to have the most complex, the most sophisticated sales functions, what we typically find is that the sales function is populated with individuals who are responsible for the entire end-to-end sales workflow. Individuals who are practically responsible for everything from prospecting to all of the activities associated with the management of opportunities, including the design of solutions, the generation of proposals, the negotiation of terms, and so on and so on. And to make things worse, are often responsible for chaperoning orders once they've won them through production. And then to make things worse still, what we actually discover when we look closely at sales environments, even sales environments in sophisticated organizations, is that it's actually, we're actually understating the issue to say that salespeople are responsible for the end-to-end sales workflow. What we actually discover is that in most organizations, salespeople have established themselves or have been established by management as the sole interface between the organization and its customers. In other words, it's quite realistic to say that we are seeing multitasking or an artisanal mode of behavior that is quite comparable to how production would have looked 100+ years ago. And ladies and gentlemen, what I'm suggesting is that is the direction of our solution. Or to be more accurate, I'm suggesting that industrializing the sales function is the direction of our solution. So obviously we've seen enormous gains from industrializing production environments, but they're not the only environments in recent years that have become industrialized. We've done it to engineering environments, project environments as a subset of engineering. We've done it to even the finance department and most, if not all, other departments within the organization. And if talking about industrializing sounds a little bit cumbersome, it's easy to recognize what the essence of industrialization is. It's what Adam Smith talked about at the turn of the last century, this thing that we call division of labor or specialization. So this massive increase in productivity, massive increase in product quality, in throughput, in productivity using any yardstick we might wish to use, all of that can be traced back to division of labor. Mechanization, if you think about it, or automation, is just a subset of division of labor. Without division of labor, automation wouldn't even be possible, at least until just recently in peculiar examples like fab plants. So the essence of this massive change, the increase that we've seen in productivity, is division of labor. But the curious point here is that when we look at the sales function, we see a complete absence of division of labor, that which has caused such incredible change in the productivity of the rest of the organization. So obviously, my suggestion here is that we apply division of labor to the sales function. Now, there are oftentimes instinctive reactions to that suggestion. You know, people will feel that, well, gosh, sales must be different from production. Surely it must be that the idea of applying division of labor to sales doesn't make sense. But the interesting thing is, and you can pose some of these, you can raise some of these objections in question time if you like. I don't have time to answer them all, but if you line up all of those objections and you ask one simple question of each of the objections, you discover that they dissolve. And the question that you ask of them is, does this same objection apply in a production environment? And in every case, in my experience, whatever objection salespeople or sales managers raise to the idea of applying division of labor to sales, we discover that the exact same objection almost certainly was raised in the past by production people. You know, for example, it's tempting to assume that where we have a single individual responsible for an entire end-to-end workflow, that quality is better. Salespeople will say, well, if we have to have multiple people working together to prosecute an opportunity, surely our ability to win that opportunity will be compromised. Well, why surely? I'm sure artisans 100 years ago at some point argued that if they let go of the responsibility for the entire end-to-end workflow and had multiple people collaborating to produce the output, the consequence would certainly be a reduction in quality. And of course, we know that nothing could be further from the truth. So you can probe me on that in more detail in question time. So what I want to do is dig right into talking about how do we apply the notion of or the idea of division of labor to the sales function. And I think it's tempting for us, particularly for engineers, to forget just how difficult, how complex this idea of division of labor is. And the reason we forget is that most of us have grown up in environments where division of labor is the lay of the land. You know, we live in an environment, division of labor for us is almost like water for fish. But in sales environments, that's absolutely not the case. So if we want to understand the salesperson or the sales manager's perspective, we have to imagine how would our reception have been were we back in time 100 years proposing division of labor to the craft shop or to the artisan. So what it's important, I think, for production people and engineering people to understand is that there are some very, very important prerequisites that have to be in place for division of labor to be applied productively to any environment. We take these for granted in production environments, but where sales environments are concerned, we have to wind back to basics and remind ourselves that without standardized workflows, or routings as we call them in production environments, without the centralization of scheduling, and without a formal approach to management, division of labor is not only impossible, but division of labor, if you attempt it, will lead to chaos and ultimately to a rapid diminution in product quality. But of course, history shows us that if we get these three things right, these three basic principles, if we standardize routings, if we centralize scheduling, and if we put in place a formal management regime cognizant of the fact that environments where we apply division of labor become fragile, then we can build incredibly productive environments. So all these points apply absolutely to sales. So what I want to do is walk you through these four basic concepts: division of labor, standardization, the centralization of scheduling, and a formal management regime, and show you how they play out when you apply what we call sales process engineering, which is really nothing special. All we're talking about is the application of process engineering principles. And by the way, we're talking pre-lean, pre-TOC, pre-Six Sigma. The ideas that I'm presenting to you here in this lean webinar, I'm embarrassed to say, really have not a lot to do with lean technically, because I'm presenting to you the notion of division of labor, and it's almost embarrassing that in the 21st century we have to question whether or not division of labor actually makes sense in a modern environment. But believe it or not, there are people out there today asking exactly the same question, and I suspect in your organization you won't have to walk too far to find them. If you don't believe me, take a recording of this video and play it in your sales department. So let's talk about division of labor. In a modern organization, the sales function is essentially the salesperson. I mean, sure, there's marketing types too, but for the most part, the marketing types and sales operate in two completely different vacuums. Marketing does stuff, and there is perhaps some connection between what marketing does and what salespeople do, but you would have to dig hard to find the connection in most organizations. It's very rare for us to come across an organization where marketing generates anywhere near the lion's share of the opportunities that are being prosecuted by salespeople, even though a careless observer would assume, or could be forgiven for assuming that that was the purpose of marketing. So if we look at a salesperson, sales function, same thing in a typical organization, what we notice straight away is that there's an enormous diversity of activities being performed by these people. A tiny share of their time, about 8%, is spent on those critical face-to-face business development meetings. And the rest of a typical salesperson's time is spent on customer service tasks, being involved in fulfillment or project management, as they like to call it, opportunity management and all of the clerical activities associated with the prosecution of sales opportunities, social activities, prospecting. Okay, so of course, if we call all of those activities sales, we can fool ourselves into thinking that all of these activities are similar in nature. But if we look at them, we recognize that customer service tasks, for example, and project management, if you like, over here, and admin tasks over here, and business development tasks over here, I don't think there are any activities in the modern organization that could be possibly more different from one another. So the potential here, of course, is to apply division of labor, and there's some obvious reasons why it would make sense. The trick is, where do we make the cuts? if we're dividing up responsibility, where do we draw the demarcation lines? Well, in my experience, there are two places where you need to draw the lines, and these two places are not obvious. So the first division you should be making is between outside activities and inside activities. I'm less concerned at first blush about whether activities are sales activities or customer service activities or production activities. I just want to differentiate, and I would encourage you to differentiate between those activities that are performed in the field and those activities that are performed inside. And you need to make sure that the responsibility for those activities is the very first division that you make. In other words, people who work outside don't come in, and people who work inside don't go out, with one notable exception, that's project leaders, and you can ask me about that later. Now, the reason this is important is because if you think about it, a field-based person has a completely different MO, method of operation, from an inside person, which means their work environment has to be structured completely differently. It means that they end up adopting a set of standard operating procedures, explicitly and implicitly, that are fundamentally different from inside people. And it means that the management structure around this person has to be completely different as well. And as a consequence, if you take somebody who is fundamentally an outside person and bring them inside, they perform very badly, and they disrupt the performance of the rest of your inside team. And similarly, if you take an inside person and put them outside, then they don't perform too well either. So the first most important division is between outside activities and inside activities. We haven't talked about sales versus production yet. The next important distinction is between meaningful selling conversations and everything else. So what I would encourage you to do is to first take stock of all those activities that genuinely need to be performed in the field. Some of those activities might be sales meetings, some of them might be visits to client sites to look at issues in production. And you want to make sure that those field activities, all of them, are performed by dedicated field people. The next thing that you want to do is to take stock of all of the meaningful selling conversations that occur or should occur, and make sure that those people who are responsible for meaningful selling conversations do not have any other competing responsibilities. Now, I raised previously the idea of having field salespeople and inside salespeople. I'm a huge fan of inside salespeople because there are many, many meaningful selling conversations that absolutely do not have to occur in the field. And salespeople, while they will argue with this point, will actually prove it, or actually provide you with proof, I should say, when you observe your parking lot and discover that salespeople's cars seem to spend a strange amount of time parked in the company parking lot. Or if they're not in the parking lot, you can bet your bottom dollar that they're spending a reasonable percentage of time parked in the home carport while the salesperson is inside performing a bunch of activities on the telephone that can be performed there more productively than they can in the field. So salespeople, ironically, will argue that it is only face-to-face selling activities that are efficacious, but they will spend a good percentage of their time on the telephone, either in home or in a regional office or in the head office, having telephone-based conversations. So what we want to do is ensure that if a field person is performing meaningful selling conversations, that's all they do. And if an inside person is responsible for meaningful selling conversations, that's all they do. They don't take care of any customer service issues. They don't do any clerical. They don't prepare proposals. They simply sell. They're the two most important divisions that you can possibly make. So with that in mind, what I want to do is to introduce you to a slightly more complex diagram of what your sales function would look like if you took these principles, would likely look like, if you took these principles and applied them consistently to your organization. So because this is a little bit complicated, those engineers in the midst will love this, but it is nonetheless a little complicated. What I'm going to do is hold the magnifying glass over different elements of this sales environment and describe it to you one step at a time. So on the left here, we have a customer service team. Now, pretty much every organization has a customer service team, but most organizations don't recognize the criticality of their customer service team, and as a consequence, their customer service team is nowhere near as robust as it should be. Now, the reason the criticality of customer service isn't recognized is that it is because in most organizations, salespeople assume responsibility for customer service. And as a consequence, your customer service reps end up being handmaidens to your field salespeople and never as a consequence take full ownership of customer service. And because of this, management never recognizes the true criticality of customer service. What we're about to do is to suggest to salespeople, or in fact to dictate to salespeople, that they will no longer, under any circumstances, have any involvement with customer service responsibilities. And then it behooves us as managers to make sure that our customer service team is strong and robust and big enough with enough protective capacity to easily absorb the ebbs and flows of demand on them. So the obvious question is, what is customer service in this new environment going to be responsible for? Well, customer service is going to be responsible for entering orders, for processing RFQs, in other words, generating quotes, and we're probably going to have a specialist within the CSR team, the customer service team, who's responsible for quoting, certainly in an organization of this size. But the customer service team is also going to be responsible for fielding all inbound inquiries and any inbound inquiries that are essentially orders. In other words, any inbound inquiry where the customer has an understanding of what their requirements are, meaning they can either describe it or they can quote the line item numbers, those orders will be taken and processed by the customer service team. So the customer service team will triage all inbound traffic to the organization, and anything that is a simple transaction, be it an order or a request for quote, where the customer has a clear understanding of what their requirements are, that traffic will be intercepted and processed by the customer service team. Now, this is a very important point, and the reason we're starting with customer service is if your organization is doing 20 or 50 or $100 million a year in sales, most of that revenue is repeat transactions. Most of that revenue it is derived from transactions that do not require any selling in a true sense of the word selling. And it makes no sense whatsoever to have those transactions processed by salespeople, because it will waste salespeople's capacity, and it will allow salespeople to get into the habit of not being salespeople, which is a very bad thing to occur where salespeople are concerned. So we're going to first build, or you're going to first build, a robust customer service team and ensure that that customer service team has plenty of protective capacity so that everybody in the organization can be comfortable with the capability of and the capacity of your customer service representatives. We're not going to dictate to customers that they must interact with customer service. What we're going to ensure is that your customer service team's service quality is so insanely great that customers will, of their own volition, vote with their own 2 feet and prefer to, if at all possible, transact with customer service than anyone else in the organization. So that's the first critical change that we're making. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to work on inside sales. And in many organizations, there is no inside sales team, which represents a fantastic opportunity. So I don't care what your organization is. I don't care what you sell. I don't care if you're an engineer-to-order environment selling $1 million plus transactions. I suspect that there are opportunities for you to sell on the telephone. I suspect that there are opportunities that a capable inside sales team, I'm not talking telemarketers, I'm talking true capable salespeople with headsets on in front of computers, there are opportunities that they can process, that they can prosecute without requiring the involvement of field-based representatives. And what I'm suggesting is all of those opportunities should be routed not to field representatives, but to a dedicated inside sales team. And if you don't have an inside sales team currently, and by an inside sales team, I don't mean customer service, I mean a team of people who are outbound, who have opportunities served up to them by marketing, and whose job is to get on the phone and pursue those opportunities just like a field salesperson would, except in this case, these people will never leave the office. So this is a huge opportunity because in just about every organization we work with, there are opportunities that can be prosecuted on the phone. And in those occasions where those opportunities are being passed to field salespeople actually slow down the velocity of opportunities and cause an extension in opportunity lead time by virtue of their field-based mode of operation. So the next thing that we're going to do after ensuring that we have a robust customer service team is build an inside sales team. In many cases, we're going to take some representatives from the field. You're almost certainly going to have representatives in the field who don't like the idea of traveling, 4 or 5 days a week. And you can turn them into inside salespeople. But what we need to ensure is when we turn them into inside salespeople, we need them to adopt an inside method of operation. They cannot bring their outside MO inside with them. In other words, it is not acceptable for these people to make a telephone call, hang up the phone, go and make themselves a coffee and stroll around the organization chatting, readying themselves for the next telephone call. Our expectation will be that these people perform 30 plus meaningful conversations a day. And they can readily, easily perform that volume of meaningful conversations because, of course, they're office-based. There's no requirement for them to drive from meeting to meeting. And believe me, it's possible it's quite reasonable, even in a technical sales environment, for an inside salesperson to have 30 meaningful conversations a day and still have time to have morning tea and afternoon tea and lunch and stroll around a little bit and tell one that got away stories. So the important point is we want a reasonable volume of work from these people here. The next interesting point is that in this environment, we're not expecting salespeople to generate their own sales opportunities. What we're doing is reconfiguring the marketing department. We're introducing the marketing department to sales, and we're getting the marketing department to understand that the role of marketing, or at least the role of promotions, to a very great and meaningful extent is to generate sales opportunities. And this in many cases requires a re-engineering of the marketing function, but it's a very important re-engineering exercise because of the fact that it is enormously wasteful for salespeople, either inside salespeople or field salespeople, to be involved in the generation of sales opportunities. And the reason it is wasteful is that sales opportunities can and should be generated in batches, where salespeople interact with prospective customers one-on-one. Increasingly, there's a requirement to look online to generate sales opportunities. So there's a requirement to engage in pay-per-click advertising, to build websites and to SEO those websites, and to make landing pages, and to build lists, and to broadcast emails to list members, and to perform a whole bunch of activities that are performed to batches of prospects that need the special capability and the resources that only live in your promotions team. Now, in most marketing teams, those resources exist but aren't being used, or are being used for purposes that don't have a direct causal connection to the generation of sales opportunities. So it's very, very important that you fix that and get your marketing people to understand that one of their most important reasons for existence is to build and maintain a queue of sales opportunities upstream from the inside sales team and upstream from your field sales team, which we'll get to in just a second. So that's inside sales, and in most organizations, there is massive upside potential in building an inside sales team, and it's very quick and easy to do. And if you're looking at this as a massive change, to my mind, the creation of an inside sales team and the scaling of that inside sales team as soon as you have proof of concept is just an amazing opportunity to get some quick wins on the board and to have a very immediate and meaningful impact on order volumes. So the last component of this model is the field sales piece. So in the field sales piece, you can see that we have, in this case, 2 business development people, business development consultants, we call them. In front of each is a queue of appointments, and those appointments are maintained for them by dedicated sales coordinators or executive assistants. So one trick that we learned years ago is that it's much cheaper to pair field-based salespeople up with office-based executive assistants than it is to try and achieve the same volume of activity that you could in this configuration by adding additional salespeople. So here are the numbers. A salesperson working in this configuration, even if he is covering a large territory, let's say the whole of the US, when we take into account that at higher opportunity volumes, it becomes very easy to batch opportunities by region. What we end up with is a field salesperson who's performing 20 appointments a week reasonably comfortably, an average of 4 a day, 5 days a week. And that's only possible because we've partnered a salesperson up with a sales coordinator, and of course because we have the marketing department now in alignment with sales. But if we wanted to achieve the same volume of activity in a traditional sales environment, for every 1 salesperson you have currently, you would have to employ 9 more. And of course, if you did employ 9 more salespeople for every 1 that you do currently, you'd probably discover that there weren't enough potential customers for them to talk to, so most of them would end up sitting around doing nothing or performing endless milk runs visiting existing customers. So a better approach, to my mind, is to reduce significantly the size of your field team Many of your salespeople in this environment will be quite happy to transition inside. Some of them can become project leaders. And all that you need to do to achieve that is to partner your salespeople up with dedicated sales coordinators. I call them sales coordinators and executive assistants interchangeably because the trick to making this pairing work is to have the sales coordinator operate exactly as an executive assistant operates when we're dealing with a senior executive. In other words, in this pairing here, the sales coordinator owns the salesperson's calendar and the portfolio of open opportunities. Project leaders, as I touched on previously, are technical people, probably engineers who want to be more customer-facing. And project leaders are the only people who move between the field and head office. And the reason why we have project leaders is to avoid salespeople becoming entangled in delivery where complex sales opportunities are concerned. So that's a brief overview of the environment. What I want to do before we finish is touch briefly on standardization and the centralization of scheduling. I'm going to skip over standardization. You've glanced at this slide here and you know exactly what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is this configuration requires that we approach sales opportunities just as we approach production environments by ensuring that we have a standard routing for each opportunity type. Now that's essential where division of labor is concerned. If we don't have a standard routing, then we will obviously end up with chaos. I want to talk a little bit more about the centralization of scheduling, and really what we're trying to address here is the requirement when we apply division of labor to synchronize all of the components of the machine. So there's a couple of things, three things that we do to achieve that. The first thing that we do is we pair salespeople up with sales coordinators. So the critical scheduling decisions about who is going to do what when, are not made by salespeople in the field, they're made by sales coordinators back in head office. The second thing that we do, as per the couple of diagrams you've seen of the resourcing of this environment, is we ensure that, sales coordinators, that inside salespeople, that promotions or marketing people, and that customer service people are all co-located. Not only are they all in head office because we no longer have regional sales offices, but they all work in very close proximity to one another, ideally in an open plan office environment with vanity boards lowered to the absolute minimum height. And one of the benefits of having all of these people co-located is if we can get them to collaborate in real time, listen in on each other's telephone calls, we can go an awful long way towards synchronizing the organization as a whole, because it's these people who on a day-to-day basis are making critical decisions that impact the overall operations of the firm. Not just sales operations, but production operations as well. The next thing that we're going to do is put in place a program of rolling WIP meetings, work in process meetings. So you probably already have an 8 a.m. production WIP. What we're going to do is ensure that the person who runs your production WIP then comes into the customer service team, and at 8:15 we have a customer service WIP, and whoever led the customer service WIP goes into the inside sales WIP at 8:30. And then once a week we have any field representatives dial in for a slightly longer WIP. So what we're doing at the beginning of each day is we're having each function synchronize its watches, as it were, and we're ensuring that a representative from each function tells the story, or transfers information from the previous function in the value chain. The last component of scheduling, and this is a critical requirement, is that we eliminate sales commissions. Now, the argument for this is a contentious point, but the argument for this is very, very simple, so I'm not going to labor it. The reason we need to eliminate sales commissions when we apply division of labor in the sales function is exactly the same as the reason why we eliminated piece rate pay in a production environment. And that is that when we transition from a workflow being owned by an individual to being, to being a team endeavor, there must be one central person who beats the drum to which the various team members march. And piece rate pay makes each individual contributor the drummer, which is the antithesis of what we're looking for in a team-based environment or in division of labor. So this is not a philosophical position, this is a practical position. It is not possible to apply division of labor in any environment and to maintain piece rate pay without rendering managers impotent. So, the last point, management by numbers. one of the marvelous things about reconfiguring your sales function along the lines that I'm advocating is the sales function starts to look a hell of a lot like a production environment. And one of the great things about that for production people and for engineers is that you guys already know how to run a production environment. So all we have to do to make the sales function inherently manageable is to make visible a small number of critical performance indicators. Where the sales environment is concerned, what we need to ensure is that whoever is managing that environment can see the location of and the content of a small number of critical queues of work in process at different points within the sales value chain. And if you think about it, that is no different from how you manage production. So if you look at the dashboards of organizations who are implementing this approach to sales, you will notice an alarming comparison to the dashboards that you would be using to manage your production function. You see gauges showing the size of queues of work in progress, and you see run charts. Whoever thought you'd see a run chart in a sales environment? And you see run charts showing throughput over time at critical points in the sales environment. So the reason I'm making this point is I'm so used to engineers throwing their hands up in the air, giving up on sales because sales is some weird kind of black magic that they have resolved not to understand. My point today is that is not the reality, that is or that doesn't have to be the reality. In fact, that is the problem with sales environments. If you're an engineer or a production person, you already know how to fix sales. There's nothing that I've told you here today that should be news to you. I'm just giving you permission today to take what you know about engineering a process and apply that knowledge to the sales environment. It's yours for the taking. Go to it, and good luck.